Hey everyone, thank you for joining the September ArxNimbus Risk Call. David and Andrew will be discussing digital twin technology today, where you can gain more accurate predictions and better decision making, as well as truly optimizing the cybersecurity program. I'm gonna turn it over to you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. Appreciate it. We're excited to everyone joining today. And before we jump in, just wanted to give you a quick overview of what we'll be discussing. Um, we'll be looking at what a digital twin is, how it applies to the cybersecurity risk management field and disciplines from a management and assessment perspective. We'll look at some key benefits to the organization, such as cybersecurity strategy and budget optimization, insurance planning, remediation, solution selection, regulatory compliance, and board management communication. We'll also show a little about how we go about solving for the digital twin, and as well share some results of a recent case study that got a lot of attention and some great results. So with David, with that, welcome everyone. And we got a lot going on, obviously, in today's world. It is a very prescient and relevant discussion about how individuals and companies can up the game in a pretty rapidly changing and evolving threat environment.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. And this is a very, very exciting field. Up until very recently, and I say this as a CIO and CISO myself, have not had the opportunity to take the cybersecurity program and construct a digital twin of it. Now, what do we really mean by that? Well, it's in order to be a digital twin, it has to have all the variables, the dynamics of the real thing. And we'll get into here in a second kind of an intro to what digital twin technology is, and then show you some examples of real world organizations that are using this today and the kind of results that they're getting from that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, David, I think to kick it off, maybe for the audience, why would someone want to use a digital twin, right? And what is maybe is the best place to start so we can set on a level foundation of definitions here.
Yeah, and I've just put in the Q&A a link to a McKinsey article that's very insightful on this and goes into those very dynamics, Andrew. You know, it just like, here's how it has helped organizations in a variety of different areas, different fields, different industries, to really kind of sort through what their options are. And at the end of the day, the digital twin is all about optimization. It's all about managing these variables that are the real things that are controlling what the outcomes are going to be, and getting them to a point where it's optimal cost, optimal timing, optimal, et cetera. And so we get to a stage where we really can't just experiment on the live organization, if you will. So this is kind of the ethos of the digital twin. There was a thing in the field of medicine. I mean, if you go way back to its origins in ancient Greece, the Hippocratic Oath. And one of the first things in the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. Yep. So how do we really know that we can take the cybersecurity program and say, well, maybe we should convert all of our firewalls to this sort of approach. Maybe we should be using tokenization or containerization. Maybe we should, these are kind of untested concepts in many ways in a lot of organizations in how we apply these. And yet we go ahead and we apply them anyway, not knowing what the results are going to be. So that really is experimentation. Now, none of us, going back to medicine, would want any of our doctors to be sort of well, here, try this, call me in 2 weeks. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, well, try this other thing. I'm going to give you a shot with this and see if that does it. Nobody is going to have to, nor should have to suffer through experimentation on that basis. And yet, in a sense, without a way of simulating outcomes, that's kind of what we're doing with many of our cybersecurity programs in corporate America today and in public organizations as well. So it's time to get beyond that. This is part of the maturing of the cybersecurity field as a profession, if you will. And maybe, I don't know, Andrew, should we go into a little bit about digital twin fundamentals?
Yeah, I mean, I would to kind of back up just a little bit on the point you made. You know, we talk a lot on the webinars about the ability to bridge the tactical with the strategic. And this really is that in kind of living color, right? The ability to look at tactical decisions in with a strategic lens. Because it's not just about do no harm. It's also about do no harm and know the cost, right? So what is the cost and the benefit that will actually, these decisions that you're making and testing against actually provide the organization? How do you get senior leadership buy-in, right? So we run into this all the time with, you know, here you have an organization that's struggling just to keep up. They're under-resourced, under lack of people, lack of capital, or they're trying to do a lot more with less, frankly. And when they go to their leadership and say, look, we really want to pursue this initiative or that initiative, you know, how do they get an understanding and communicate that benefit to the organization in a compelling way, right? And of course, at ArxNimbus,
Right.
we, you know, provide that economic valuation on top of these digital twins. So, yeah, I think that's a good way to look at this as we discuss it, is the bridging of the tactical and the strategic in a way that allows the practitioners and senior leadership to be in lockstep about what they really want to achieve as an organization, and then how do they prioritize the initiatives, the spending, and the priorities to optimize their program overall.
Exactly. And it's a lot about options and outcomes. So we've got an option we're considering. You could call it hypothesis testing if you prefer that sort of phrase. And then let's see what outcomes that particular strategy or tactic can yield given the real world parameters that we're dealing with. So digital twin got its start in kind of two places, and two good examples of how this works. One was in architecture and the other was in the military. And so in architecture, you're building, think of a skyscraper you've driven by or seen in a city you may have visited. And you know, you're simulating in today's world all of the variables that are affecting that structure, right? So things like wind loads. If you're on the West Coast, things like earthquake scenarios. What is the structural nature of the components if it's built from a steel core and then has stone cladding or whatever materials are going to perform in a certain way? And these, of course, are now known. So we've got parameters, you know, steel of a certain grade will bend in a certain way under a wind load and so on. So now you can start to see, we can simulate all of those kinds of dynamics. And literally the digital twin technology is what has allowed us to now build the massive kind of structures that we build. If you think about, if you're in the New York area, there are at least 3 or 4 super talls now on the horizon of the New York skyline. If you look at them, they're fundamentally narrower than the other skyscrapers of the Chrysler Building and older legacy skyscrapers and structures. And the reason for that is we've been able to do these kinds of simulations. Now in the military, what we have is, if you think about, you know, even just the old war movies, right, that many of us may have seen, quite often they'll cut to a scene where there's a mock-up of the battlefield, and it could be done with kind of Lego size things. There's some, you know, toy tanks out here. There's soldiers lined up over here, artillery, etc. And the planners, the strategists, and the generals are playing out different scenarios on the actual battlefield on which the battle will be fought, and looking at how these scenarios are likely to turn out. And so thank goodness they're doing that, because obviously you don't want to have surprise outcomes in a military situation.
Yeah.
And actually, we got our origins here at ArxNimbus in helping with exactly that kind of process with U.S. Strategic Command and U.S. Cyber Command starting in 2017. So working with MITRE Corp and KBR and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, creating a way to simulate the risk reduction results that could be gained from certain solutions and strategies. And that was a very important exercise in that era, and somewhat of a pioneering thing as well. But with all of that, it's really taking us beyond this status of experimentation, where we have to try something in the real world and maybe encounter some consequences that would be adverse, rather than, look, let's have a test bed, let's have a digital twin over here. We can operate on it, expand it, contract it, change the variables that are driving it, and then start to see what the results are. And that's going to inform what kinds of things we do actually want to implement in the real world. So it's sort of eliminating the flying blind that many cybersecurity programs have encountered over the decades.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun, frankly. So to be honest with you, I mean, working with clients to develop some of those scenarios, to stress them, to push them, and to properly size them is a pretty engaged and fun process. Because again, the visibility that provides is something that most practitioners in the space right now currently don't have, right? So, I think, David, you asked earlier, kind of where do you start, right? And I think, the process that we have in place, you have to start from a baseline perspective, right? So that's where we hone in a lot of attention to create a digital twin. Is what is your current state of controls? What's your current state of threats and risks and your vulnerabilities, and getting the most complete picture that you possibly can of the organization as it is today. And from there, you can then start to develop those. We were to address access controls, right? Let's say we've identified 3 or 4 solutions that we think can do that. What if we want to do a major transformation to the cloud? Does that help, hinder? What if we want to do, et cetera, et cetera? And then what you'll end up at the end of the day, and we'll show you a sample report of it, is the ability not only to evaluate the options that you have in order to, or not only to identify where you really need to be, where your weaknesses are. So those kind of 3 questions.
Right.
What is your cyber risk? Where does it originate? And what's it costing the organization? And if you can establish those 3 in the baseline, a lot of that prioritization and optimization that David's talking about becomes much more crystallized. You overlay a cost-benefit analysis of, what's the gains to the organization, what's the cost to the organization. You have a winning recipe to go in front of your board and in front of senior management and say, look, we need to do this for this reason. We are open to risk here. We have a certain risk exposure. Here's how much it's going to cost. Here's how much risk we can reduce to the organization. And then you're having a trade-off discussion. So.
Exactly. And so there's a couple of key things here. One is absolutely getting that baseline status correct, so that we know we're dealing with things that are reflective of the real world conditions at this moment. So that is making sure we understand vulnerabilities, the kind of threats the organization is facing, and that we have a model that knits together and properly portrays the interactions between threats and vulnerabilities, because that's where risk comes from, ultimately. I can have a threat that's attacking me, but maybe not have a vulnerability that is exploitable by that threat. And vice versa, I could have a vulnerability, but none of the threats hitting me, at least so far, are able to exploit that vulnerability. And so understanding those dynamics is absolutely essential. Then the ability to play out various scenarios and variables. Now, many of these can be business initiatives as well. So something like a major cloud migration, digital transformation has affected many, and there are many organizations that, I mean, the major part of that wave, of course, has swept through most enterprises, but there are many organizations that are still undergoing digital transformation. That will completely change my threat surface. But do we
Mhm.
understand in what ways it's changing that? And do we know how to apply the kind of protections that we should have after digital transformation that maybe we didn't need as much beforehand?
Sure.
And that's where digital twinning comes in. So, all of these things, if I'm going to expand the business internationally, if the business is going to scale up and grow by 20% next year, a merger, an acquisition of another organization, building a new product line, these are all things that traditionally leaders have not looked at as cybersecurity dynamics. And they're not fundamentally cybersecurity dynamics. They don't usually originate from a cybersecurity objective, but they affect vastly the cybersecurity posture of the organization. And therefore, the cost of risk can go up adversely if we're not properly portraying the effects of these and sorting that out. So it's not just things like, well, maybe I should buy CrowdStrike and implement it, or maybe I should get multi-factor authentication throughout the entire organization. Those are, in fact, cybersecurity situations and variables that we try to manage. But beyond that, many of these business initiatives have consequences in cybersecurity. And it's supremely important to understand those and properly prepare for them. You know, we had a situation up until very recently where most mergers would have a cybersecurity budget component of nearly zero because they were forecasting that the effects on cyber risk would be zero. Well, out of all the possible outcomes, that's just not likely in any kind of merger situation. So you can kind of go on down the list with most of the things we consider as major strategies in corporations and in private organizations as well, including government, do have consequences in cyber risk. And it's important that we understand those and ideally ahead of time.
Yeah, no, so I mean, you raise another dynamic to this that I think is really important to highlight. So it is the tactical and the strategic, but it's also the technical and the operational, right? And for example, recently with a client, we were talking about, okay, well, what do? You have critical hardware in place, critical that are absolutely tied to your ability to operate. Um, that's both a capex and an opex issue, right? So
Yes.
those discussions usually are siloed, where people really aren't looking at, well, what do we need to do from a not just a cybersecurity risk management perspective, but from a business continuity and operational resiliency perspective, right? And the ability to show that, again, what are the effects? Why are we doing what we're doing? Having firm and sound rationale behind the types of priorities that you're going to be promoting to senior management is essential in order for success, right?
Absolutely. And that really is the opportunity to resonate with senior management on if we take action X, it's going to produce outcome Y.
Yeah.
And that is something that, especially characterizing that in dollar and cents terms around our differential cyber risk exposure and what is it going to cost us, that is something that will resonate with senior management. They may not get down in the weeds of, well, is that from correcting a firewall policy drift initiative or expanding the threat surface in this particular fashion? They may not go into that level of detail. That's for us as cybersecurity professionals and the leadership of cybersecurity efforts on the part of the company to really manage. But senior management gains by being able to get visibility on these matters, the consequences of the various trade offs, like you're saying, Andrew, and what kinds of options they have. Now, there are certain things, as with all things in life and any organization, that may be more costly to fix than it's worth. But let's go ahead and let's identify those things as well, so we understand what they are, and then perhaps find less costly alternatives to address those. So This is all part of an ongoing dynamic. It's not, we should say, digital twin as a snapshot, and then it's a static picture of things, because the world keeps moving all the time. And there's so many variables, especially in cybersecurity, that it's an ongoing process once we have the baseline built. So, Andrew,
I think just real quick on the baseline, though, it's very, very important also that there's a proper rendering of that risk exposure, right? So it's not just a cost.
Exactly.
You know, I know a lot of people we've talked to complain that, hey, well, cyber's looked at as just a cost center, right? And when we hear a lot of people saying we got to align cyber to the business. Well, the fundamental way to do that is by speaking the language of business and portraying the risk to the organization in terms that the business will understand. And until that happens, there will be a disconnect, because you can't really tie something that seems technical in nature alone without tying it to an actual business impact. So when we look at risk, we're always looking at risk is the impact, the financial impact to an organization. We're trying to minimize that risk in everything we do. And the effects of that are definitely, I've shown some of the clients that we work with, and their ability to portray that risk, get buy-in on how they're going to go about to solve that over the near term to the long term. Sorry, David, but that was it.
Yeah, no, that's spot on, Andrew. And so what we might do is kind of look at how this works, and let's just take a quick look at some of the building blocks and the processes to really create a digital twin, and then to take a look at some of the things that can be done with it once we have it there. So let me just share the screen here for a moment. And this is the typical outcome that we have. This is our ArxNimbus Thravaca risk profile. And you can see, for starters, and this happens to be Textron Corporation, this is, you know, kind of mid-tier aerospace manufacturer, defense contractor, and also provides a lot of civilian aircraft and parts, et cetera. We start really with the total digital risk that the organization can throw off. And so that, in their case, is about 166 million. Now, it's important to note, this is really kind of a fictitious number. So you'd say, well, why do we use it? Well, it's because we have to have a starting point, and through data sets of many, many thousands of organizations, most of whom have had actual losses, we can start to see what the magnitude of those losses have been in relation to their financials, their employee headcount, their industry that they're in. And you can see we've got the industry NAICS code, or NAICS code over here, 336411. So we're looking at their industry and understanding what that high-end potential for loss actually is. From there, and only once you have established that, you can start to subtract out, well, look, the organization has certain protections in place. It has multi-factor, it has a patch management program, it has certain cybersecurity initiatives that it's got active currently. And so that really is a reduction, but obviously, algebraically, if you will, you got to understand what the starting number is before you can start to subtract from it. So what we really do is then say, look, they've remediated a substantial portion of their risk. And like everything within these displays, there are tooltips, definitions, glossary sorts of things to guide the process. But the important thing is, well, who says that they've taken away 112 million, 113 million actually, of their 167 million in total digital risk exposure? Well, NIST says, number one, NIST says that if you have MFA in place, that will check the checkbox on certain controls. Now, very few people, it turns out, have, just using MFA as an example, have MFA in place throughout 100% of their systems and 100% of their enterprise. So then we say, well, you know, looks like here we've got it in place across 89% but that particular control is affecting this percentage of our total risk exposure. So 89% of that percent, if you will, determines really how much of that particular risk exposure we have actually remediated. So given all of that and all of the 1,400 odd controls that are under the purview of NIST, we have the fact that they have, and we should mention this process has been reviewed with NIST. We've sat in on a lot of their committees. We've had their product managers at NIST for CSF and for 853 review this and have approved the process after some adjustment. So this is a NIST approved process that's being used to really come up with that 113 million that's been remediated. Now, most organizations in today's world, the larger ones in particular, will have a cyber insurance policy of some type. In this case, this is probably about a $30 million, maybe $35 million policy, which we have a projected payoff because very few cyber insurance policies pay off at 100%. That is a factored payoff that's forecast of about 27.5 million. So when all is said and done, we've got just over 26 million in remaining risk exposure. Now the question is senior management first and foremost comfortable with that? And we can say, well, I'm only comfortable with zero. Well, that means you're running a cybersecurity program that the standard of which has to be 100%. And that's very difficult to attain. It's very costly to attain. And you can even think about physical security of, let's say, a facility or a building. Really attaining 100% security for that means a whole lot of extreme measures. And at some point, there is this question of risk tolerance that comes in with senior management. So what we have now is a T-score of 842, which means that they've eradicated about 84.2% of their otherwise risk exposure if they had done nothing at all. Then we've also got a benchmark against, in real time, their peers in their industry. And you can see at an 842, they're kind of in the upper third, if you will, but not quite at the level of the 916, which is the one that's leading the pack. And this is about 38 comparison organizations in their industry. So all of that's very informative. We also track cyber efficiency, how much.
David, real quick, if you go back to the T-score page.
Sure,
I
sure, yeah.
think you mentioned one thing that's critical in all of this, and we see this time and time again. You mentioned risk tolerance. Well, the organization needs to set a risk tolerance. Well, we find that a lot, and I think you can look at least anecdotally out there, that people are making decisions without a risk-informed or an assessment-driven approach, do not appropriately understand what their risk tolerance is because they don't know what that total digital risk is, and they have no insight into the amount of risk that they're currently carrying. And I know there's various ways to go about that. Each organization has their own way to identify it. Most often it's purely asset-based, et cetera. But that is a really key point you hit on, because without that, how are you making all of your decisions, and how is the management actually viewing the decisions they're being asked to make? And you can see this by a chronic underinsurance, and we hit on this a lot during these webinars because it's frustrating, frankly, and lack of investment or a lack of prioritization on obvious and critical vulnerabilities that they're facing. So just wanted to highlight that because I think this is the starting point, the value that this approach provides.
No, you're spot on, Andrew. And you have to have a starting point. So again, using the medical example, right? What happens when you go in to see the doctor? Well, I've had this pain in my knee. Well, it's going to ask, when did it start? How long has it been going on? Have you had this before? Is there any family history, et cetera? And very quickly, a good doctor is going to say, well, you know what? Let's run some tests. Let's run some tests and let's see kind of where the metrics stack up. And so without running those tests, again, we're kind of in the realm of experimentation in cybersecurity. And that's not something anyone should have to go through, either on the human body or on something as critical as the cybersecurity status of the organization. So from that, we're kind of the tests here, or the MRI of cybersecurity, if you will, and getting these results then can guide the process, including, and we won't, belabor this point, but understanding the dynamics between, individual loss types. These, for example, we track 8 loss types in our practice and what we do, but things like ransomware, intellectual property compromise, PII breach, the things that senior management would certainly understand, and then looking at what are the values of those losses that are being contributed by certain vulnerability types. So we have, for example, access control over here, and then what are the threats that can take advantage or exploit our current status with respect to that vulnerability, this one being access control as a broad category. And you can see in this, these are federal taxonomies that show us actually how much the interaction between a given threat and a given vulnerability is exposing us to in terms of loss. And you say, well, but who cares? Who cares? Well, a lot of people care about loss. Shareholders, it turns out, care. Legal probably cares. The board of directors is expected to care. And a lot of people are constituents, not just customers, but also suppliers of the organization care. A variety of people want the success of the organization and want it to continue to function uninterrupted, so they care.
Well, and in many cases, the successful operations of some of these, think about healthcare, the patients care, right? And the patients' loved ones care.
Yeah.
Because again, there's a human toll in some of these.
As they should. Yeah, as they should. And so through all of that, and we continue to work with clients on remediation and insurance. There's a dynamic between those, the different economics with both of those, and where do I get to this optimum set point? And that's a very common question that we tend to get from just about everyone. And then we can look at this through an ISO 27001 lens, or NIST 800-171 for the defense industrial base, or CMMC folks. And then also certainly NIST cybersecurity framework, CSF, as well. But all the time that we're doing these, it really comes back to this digital twin matter, which really centers around NIST 800-53. So you can say, well, look, I've got this, and we'll set this to 100. So the 26.3 million in cybersecurity risk exposure, after everything that I've remediated, after my cyber insurance policy that I've put in place. And so now I really want to go to work on this. I would like that number to move south of the 26 million, because that's a material number and it's something that we just don't want to be exposed to. Now, if I implemented a whole bunch of solutions, and so let's look broad brush at this issue first of all, then let's look in a little more detail, and then we'll go to an example, real world example of what a digital twin process can yield. So there's sort of 3 levels of this. One is overall broadly, I look at what I can do and how it's going to affect my risk exposure and get cost recovery as a result of that, cost takeout. That's important. Certainly everyone in senior management is interested in that, as are the other stakeholders. Then we'll take a look at what can be done at a detailed level. And then from there, look at, now that you've got that, what is a complete digital twin approach to the world really going to look like? And how do you do this? So if I just look broadly, and this takes no more than a few minutes for any organization, and I say, well, if I implemented no additional interventions, I would obviously get no additional risk reduction and no additional cost recovery. That's pretty basic. If I implemented getting everything to 100% level of perfection, which, as we said before, is virtually unattainable in the real world, I would get back my total risk exposure, which is currently running for Textron at least at about 26.3 million. But I know that neither of those extremes is really something that one extreme I don't want, and the other extreme is unattainable. So where do I fall in the middle? Well, if I could reduce, let's say 60%, just for an experimental number here. 60% of my total risk exposure today, remaining risk exposure or self-insurance cost, is 15.7 million. Now, in finance, they can tell us if we did not have any other arrangements in place and we're carrying 26 million in risk exposure, we have to either increase our policy, add more remediations, more solutions, strategies, et cetera, or we've simply got to accept the fact that we have 26 million annually in cyber risk exposure, and we have to have a reserve. We have to have a set aside. Now, whether I've done that or not, I am in fact self-insuring myself as an organization over and against those losses. So if you think about the recent United Healthcare situation with Change Healthcare, they have now established over $4 billion in reserves against those losses. Losses in their case are not totally known, and this is very typical, can take a year or more, even 2 years, to be able to identify the magnitude of these losses after the event, which is very disturbing for everyone involved, of course. And there are ways, if I can forecast that ahead of time, to get out ahead of that. They had not had these reserves in place prior to the loss, probably because they had not taken the time to get visibility to what their exposure actually was. So these are real dollars. I can test that because I can call up my insurer and say, what if I got an additional 26 million in cyber insurance? And they will give me a quote for that. And I will see the expense of transferring that to a commercial entity. Now, it's very rare that I can transfer all of my cyber risk exposure to a commercial insurer. They generally don't like to do that. They like to see that we've got certain hygiene things in place, certain measures the organization has taken, et cetera. So I really need to think in terms of what can I fix internally, first and foremost. And let's say that I was able to eradicate about 15.7 million of this. I would have to increase the status of my current controls by an additional 60% in order to do that. And now I would have to find places where I can actually do that. So you say, well, that sounds great. It's, kind of an academic exercise at that level. But what do I now do? What can I actually do to achieve that? So for that, I, like it or not, have to look down at kind of get in the weeds, if you will, at a very detailed level. And these are the things that, internal auditors can point us towards, our cybersecurity leaders can point us towards. What are the options that we really have? But first and foremost, before that, it is really understanding NIST has laid out for us and for all organizations in every industry a set of controls that are required for proper cybersecurity protection. So if we look at audit and accountability, for example, one very detailed item is the content of audit records. And you can see NIST has very specific things that I need to do if I'm going to, and it seems like this really detailed thing. It seems, you'll get bored with this instantly almost, but this is the level at which these enhancements, improvements, and advancements need to be made in order to move the needle. So with that, I can say, well, we've got someone on the team, Terry, who really could take this on. And so let's assign it to Terry. And then let's take a look at, well, Terry says he could get that done by probably about the 15th of November. And that would move the needle on this particular one to, let's say, an 83% capability, where it's sitting at 59% right now. So that alone, and that sub-control is worth about 22,008 towards our goal of reducing this 22.6 million in, or 0.26 million rather, in total risk exposure. So this is kind of the place where the digital twinning kind of starts, and we're able to experimentally go in without any consequences on the organization and say, how do we arrange these things? How do we address the requirements of NIST and the kinds of things that we know we have to do and, satisfy regulators, auditors, and get ourselves to a better place on risk. So if you think about all of that, there are over 600 pages. I'm sorry, not 600 pages, more pages than that. 600 individual NIST remediation playbooks that we work with every day in accomplishing this. So there's a lot of detail. This is why we tend to have advisory as a component in really building and guiding the digital twin. But once it's in place, then that is turned over to the organization and they can run it from there and call us in as needed to do additional scenarios. So within that, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you because I think you have an example of how this is.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe show this solution selection capability because I think we'll show that in this process if you want to, or I can just go straight.
Yeah,
this is another area which is the testing of, as David pulls it back up, and you'll see it in the case study that we have here.
So
the ability to actually.
Yeah, exactly. And so if we're sitting over here and we're Textron, we might say, well, in addition to everything that we can do, and of course, a lot of these NIST things, it's worth pointing out, deal with policy, procedure, training. So you can't forget about that. And too often, sometimes organizations will say, I'm going to buy product X. Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll put that in, install it, and then everything's going to be great. And it's rarely that simple. You have to have the way of maintaining the results from product X, training our people to use product X, making sure the procedures and policies are rewritten to gain full value from product. So none of those things can I just buy something canned off the shelf, slap it in, if you will, and then get the full results. So it really needs to be part of an overall effort. Now, assuming that there are certain solutions that are very compelling in cybersecurity today. And, look, let's just say it. I mean, all of us as cybersecurity practitioners are blessed with the fact that we have some of the most sophisticated solutions known to humanity and across the entire technology spectrum to apply to the many challenges of cybersecurity today. So when we look at this, and these are just the ones that we currently have profiled, and we're continuing to add more on a pretty active basis. But included in this, we have probably at least the top 10 most frequently used cybersecurity solutions that are out there. And things like a Cloudflare, which are nearly ubiquitous, Checkpoint software, which has been around for quite a while, a variety of others. So we have also several that are very well known. Let's take Tenable as an example. And so now we can say, well, what if I took this digital twin and I implemented Tenable? Tenable as a SIM system. Now, we should also say there are different ways to implement any of these solutions. I can go full bore. I can implement them across my entire enterprise. I can implement only certain modules and leave others out for the future, perhaps, et cetera. I can hire a very high-priced, very thorough consulting group to implement this, or I could try to implement it on my own, or maybe through my MSP that I currently work. So lots of different variables in this, but overall, as kind of a central tendency, what if I were to implement this particular solution? And so I can say, well, there are certain uplift factors that through independent reviews and through even customer comments, as well as post-audit data, that I can know that this solution is going to affect certain controls. Now, if it didn't affect any controls, obviously it's the tree that fell in the forest and there's no outcome. But solutions in cybersecurity today are bought in this multi-billion-dollar global market that's very brisk and growing very rapidly in order to change the status on one's controls. So we can measure that. Many Many have, there's lots of data on these things that's been developed independently. And that's not just a function of what the vendor may be telling us or what someone else is reporting. So in this case, what we've got is we take that baseline of Textron and we say, okay, well, with Tenable, we're going to have a shift in controls. And you can see right away that 26.3 million basically went down to about 18.3. So that's a material gain. So right away we have millions in cost.
I think we're still stuck on the other screen. I don't know if it popped up or not.
Oh, yeah, let's see. How do we maybe share this?
But I'll be able to show them in the, there you go.
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Okay, sorry, that wasn't interacting. Somehow wasn't scrolling. But so we have our baseline here. And then with this particular solution, it just happens to be Tenable. We get to 18.3 million in self-insurance costs. So that is a cost takeout for us on an annualized basis. And here we go, because now we're towards the top of the pack in our benchmark group. So we're at 890 now, and we moved there from an 842. And so we can start to see, well, where did that real difference come from? And here's Textron before Tenable and Textron after Tenable and ransomware. Less of an impact, perhaps, in PII breach exposure, but a little bit gets picked up in digital fraud as well as IP compromise. So those are all important, and they add to our gains here. And then controls uplifts. And this is the expected loss before, and then the expected loss after, and you see capabilities are moving up, obviously, as a result of this solution. So those are the kinds of things we can start to see. And but as we said earlier, this is partly a function of cybersecurity strategies on the digital twin. And it's also a function of business strategies as well on the digital twin. All of them kind of aggregate to get us to ultimately a better place.
Yeah, that's great. And let me pull up. Yes, did that come in through, David?
Yeah, that looks good over here.
Great. Yeah, and so what we just went through was, what we look at when we look at a core baseline risk profile. And again, what we're trying to answer for the client are three foundational questions, which is, again, how much cyber risk does the company have? Where is that risk originating? And what is that risk actually costing the organization? So from that baseline, we're able then to establish the baseline. You saw the T-scores, you saw the self-insurance cost. This is the real number, right, where we want to play. We also want to look at, going back to that risk tolerance discussion, David, when we look at a full program, we're looking at how much risk are they remediating and or transferring, right? So in this case, the organization is transferring or remediating around 74.2% of that risk, yet they still are well below industry peers. And their current NIST CSF, again, we show results. This report happens to be mainly focused on CSF. We saw them both 800.53 and CSF. And then we also show where the organization currently stands on a risk journey, which is showing both what it's remediated and also what it's transferred. And again, this organization stands probably about 365. Once we're able to get that, we're also able to have that discussion that David talked about, which is, well, we hear this a lot. How much do we want to focus on remediation? How much insurance should we actually have? And do we want to self-fund? Do we want to go for a commercial line? And those are discussions, obviously, that require having a good understanding of how much risk actually is on the table that you're trying to either remediate and or transfer. So that's part of the baseline we discussed. What I'll show you, though, next is or are some scenarios that we've done in the past. So one, for example, would be, what if we were to uplift our budgets? Let's say medium range or high range, and working with the clients to see what's doable under current circumstances. In this case, we identified a $4.5 million set point for a budget at a medium and a 9.2 for this company's budget at the higher range. And then we looked at, okay, well, what would that do? We developed scenarios around what we think would be doable with that funding. And again, going back to the operational and the technical component, some of this discussion can also revolve around how many new FTEs or personnel do you need to accomplish these tasks, right? So in this particular case, it's not just about solution selection and certain types of transformation projects. It's also about, well, are we understaffed and under-resourced overall? We're
Yeah,
able to
and
show, yeah,
it's worth pointing out too that just as a practical matter, we have worked with a client recently that they're actually so part of what we do here is benchmark the level of cybersecurity budget, and Gartner and IDC and others have guidelines around this with the organizations they've worked with, and when you start to look at it, so you look at cybersecurity budget funding per head count of employee in the organization, cybersecurity budget funding per dollar of revenue, et cetera. You start to get a picture of this, and really the benchmarking on this particular organization I'm thinking of came out, it's worth saying, at their budget was about 17% of what a representative sample of their peers would have in place. So now
yeah,
a lot of organizations, they just go through the budgeting cycle. It's maybe additive each year. So they say, well, we need to do this initiative, we need to fund these, maybe increase headcount in cybersecurity group. But it's not, how often do they really step back and say, where are we overall on what we're spending versus what others are spending that are maybe in a better place than we are today? And
yeah,
so that really is a key part of this too.
absolutely. Right sizing the program. We hear this all the time. What size of program should we have? What kind of resources should we be trying to secure in order to be an effective risk management organization? And what you'll see, is a lot of these organizations that are in these lower to mid 700 range, it's not that they aren't doing noble work, it's that they've just hit up against a point in which resource constraints are limiting their ability to make any more meaningful impact. So they've kind of gotten through the lower hanging fruit, and they're doing a lot. They're doing nobly, and great for with what they have. But again, at 99 million plus of risk exposure, more needs to be done. And so there is a point in which doing more with less, does cap out, and you really need to do more with more, and obviously do that in an effective way that spends each of those dollars, particularly in a resource constrained environment, with the maximum impact on the overall goal, which is to reduce financial impact of the organization. So that's what we're looking at here, is in these generic ones, really what would, if we were able to do certain things within a higher budget level, how would that equate in this case? And again, you're seeing changing from a 742 to an 811, pulling it out of its kind of lower status on the benchmark. We also see increases in the total low risk journey, but we're also able to then compare both what is the NIST, I guess we can go back up here. We are looking at a reduction in this case of 26.8% in their overall self-insurance cost. That's a meaningful impact. We're also seeing that they've increased the amount of risk that they've remediated close to 10%. So again, these are meaningful numbers that have a lot of resonance when you're starting to talk to the business side of the house. From the compliance side, we're also able to look at both controls. What would the uplifts be versus certain scenarios? And then also, what does it really mean from a CSF perspective in this case, from a compliance and from a risk management, as well as from an operational efficiency perspective? These are substantial gains that could be realized. When we get out of the budget scenarios, and then also, what does it look like from each of these scenarios? We did a high and a low. What's the impact on our capabilities? We can measure those. We can also measure the impact of the vulnerabilities that we currently experience. When we get out of the budget and more into specific initiatives, in this case, we were looking at, well, what if I were to just solely focus on access controls? It had been identified as a weakness in our baseline. What would that take? And let's just pick a solution. In this case, we used a few, but big fix. And so we're able to actually look at, okay, well, we're looking at about 11.56% decrease with a 4% increase in remediated risk. So you're able to measure the impact that this could have overall. And again, we can go from same type of analysis here. What are the impact on the controls, as David showed earlier? Do other types of scenarios. In this case, there was a hardware uplift. We're looking at, well, we have a bunch of antiquated hardware that we deem as critical to our business operations. Obviously, taking those offline has a cost associated. So to do that, that requires, I think very, very detailed planning. Is this really worth the risk that we'll need to take to update that? And we're able, again, to provide some detailed analysis on what that would look, but also how that would help over time mature the program overall. So these are just a kind of examples of the types of ones. Here's another one, a specific solution, as David went through earlier. What would a specific solution look like? What kind of controls uplift would we look at? How would that affect our overall risk posture? How would that decrease our risk exposure, increase the risk that we're remediating, increase both NIST CSF and NIST 800-53, as well as what impact does it have on our overall risk journey? So these are just a few, just to give a flavor of the types of, here's a migration. Again, same types of analysis. How much are we looking to decrease our self-insurance costs by? What do we think the overall impact to the organization would be? And then there are some, for example, that I'll get to here, that have negative impacts. So in this case, it was looking to do some work and some initiatives around telehealth. And in this example, it actually increased their self-insurance costs because it increased their threat exposure. Now, long term, the analysis shows that this will help their overall program, but these types of trade-offs need to be and can be identified through a digital twin approach. That in the near term, we're going to actually expand our threat environment and surface, and so we'll need to take other proactive actions, most likely in advance of this, such as beefing up controls in certain areas before we want to go through dedicating resources and time to this specific initiative.
Yeah, and this is very exciting stuff because for the first time now, the organization can start to see if I take this action, I can get this kind of outcome. And that is immensely valuable in not having to commit everything to these, ready, fire, aim exercises, if you will. And the McKinsey article that we posted at the beginning here really has kind of a definition of digital twinning as well. It says, a digital twin is a digital replica of a physical object, person, system, or process, in this case, cybersecurity program, contextualized in a digital version of its environment. Digital twins can help many organizations simulate real situations and their outcomes, ultimately allowing them to make better decisions. And so that's really what we're all about, and the kind of customer feedback that we get on those that have done a digital twin exercise and what they really gain from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really exciting. And I think this brings to life a lot of the decisions people are trying to make with an organization and struggling to get enterprise-wide buy-in for and exposure and visibility into. So it's a lot of fun working with clients on this and seeing how this can, last one we heard was, blows my mind, right? And trying to put this into some sort of contextual realm in order to have meaningful discussions and move the ball forward. Most everyone understands this, the risks they face aren't going away or down, and certain actions are needed. It doesn't wait. I know we have 1 minute left, David. I also just wanted to thank everyone for the participation. We will be doing a benchmarking study, and those that did sign up on provide us their email. We'll be sending that out the first week of October. That will be the most up-to-date benchmark for this last quarter. Earnings end of September. once we close out earnings season, we'll put together a benchmarking report, and we'll send that out to the group for information. But we encourage you, please reach out to us if you want to see this in action. We're happy to discuss in greater detail how this approach might help your organization.
Absolutely. And thanks everyone for attending, and let us know where we can be of assistance or any of these areas you'd like to explore.
Great. Thank you, everyone.